spiritual food for thought.
So if you've been following me for a while, or if you've been checking out especially this series, you're going to know one of the things that I believe is that words have meanings. And you can't take something like pastors being mentioned once in the entire New Testament and build an entire system, a job, any of that on that. You can't just take one word being mentioned once. He gave some pastors and wind up where we are, unless you're doing a lot of extra biblical stuff, a lot of stuff that's never revealed in Scripture. And once we stray from his guidelines, I think we reap what we sow. So there's a verse that's mentioned when it's talking about bishops. And a bishop would be an overseer. That's another way to translate it. And these bishops would already be older men. They would be a plurality of them in a functioning body. So you'd have more than one overseer, not just a senior pastor. And these men, the way that they would kind of become these bishops, these overseers in the local congregation, would be they would have a sanctified walk with the Lord, where there wouldn't be any real major sins they're struggling with that anyone could see. They would also be able to keep their marriage together and lead their wife first and foremost appropriately, but then also their children, even to the point that they would have faithful children, and that word faithful can also be translated as believing children. So maybe they're even empty nesters, where all of their kids have already left their house and started godly families of their own. So if you had these type of men leading the church, I think things would be very different. And one thing that's mentioned when it's talking about bishops in 1 Timothy chapter 3 is verse 6. It says, "Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation of the devil." So the interesting thing about that is novice. What is a novice? A novice is somebody who is inexperienced. I mean, simply put, he's inexperienced. He's a novice. So what I would suggest is that when you have young godly men on fire for the Lord, and there's nothing wrong with having young godly men on fire for the Lord knows we could use a lot more of them. But when he leaves his parents' home and goes to a theological seminary and spends his time there paying for his classes, and he comes out and he's got paperwork, at that point in his life, I mean, maybe he's gotten married during that time, maybe he's just started a family, but he's certainly not elderly, he's certainly not older, and for the most part, what he's accomplished in his life is being a son in his father's house and a student at the theological seminary, right? So he's been a son and he's been a student. That's pretty novice compared to what like qualifications or what we're looking at with bishops. There's a very big difference. And here we're even talked about pride, lest being lifted up with pride. What puffeth up? It's knowledge, isn't it? It's knowledge. Now, I'm not saying there's not good knowledge. We know that there is. I'm not saying that you can't learn good things at a theological seminary. But knowledge does puffeth up. And unfortunately, I think that what we have is a lot of young, puffed up, again, they're not laymen anymore. You're the layman. You sit in the pews. They have a little pedestal, right? The ground is level at the foot of the cross. It's just not in the church. So they're the ones who have the pulpit. They're the ones who have the leg up. They're the ones who have the higher exaltation in the building. They're on the stage. They've got the paperwork. They've got the education. They have knowledge. And knowledge can puffeth up. It can. And these men are also, when they start out, by and large, novices. They've been sons and they've been students. Compared to what we actually see as a bishop, very different. And a lot of these men, either the ministry suffers, and I'll tell you what, just by having that system, the ministry suffers, because the ministry is supposed to be a functioning body. And in the institutional church, a body is not allowed to function. Not allowed to function. Not as long as they have the pews and the pulpit and the preacher and, the paid clergy, any of that. Not allowed, by and large. There's a little bit of it that, peeps up sometimes, but for the most part, it's not allowed. So the ministry suffers, but then the family does too, because remember, he was supposed to be approved in his own house before he even rose to any sort of overseer role as far as function, much less being kind of the head of the church completely. So a lot of these young on fire for the Lord men, they suffer, but also we learn something early on in Scripture. In Genesis chapter 1, we learn that things reproduce after their own kind. So when you have young, zealous, knowledgeable, but potentially proud novices, they can reproduce after their own kind. They can. Now, why do I think that the divorce rate in Christianity is so high? Why do I think that so many Christian parents don't pass on successfully their faith to their children? And why do I think so many Christians struggle lifelong sometimes with some pretty bad sins? Well, part of it is, imagine if we had functioning bodies where in those functioning bodies you had overseers. And imagine if these overseers had an outlet, to oversee, to express things, to shepherd, to experientially, to speak from experience, to impart wisdom into how they have a sanctified walk, how their marriage is still together, and how they pass their faith on to their children. Imagine that. Imagine if those men could reproduce after their own kind. First of all, they do exist. They are out there. I've met some. Okay? But they're few and far between. And often in the institutional church, they're not allowed, really even an opportunity, to do what God has called them to. Okay? They're definitely not a novice, and they're definitely one that do rule their own house well. Therefore, they should be able to care for the church of God. And I think that they are the godly church leaders that he is looking for, that he wants. But we barely have them, and where we do, they almost serve no purpose. Because they're not the senior pastor. They're not the associate pastor. The service is, it's only 70 minutes long, and it's all pre-selected, and there wasn't a script or, whatever written for them. They don't have a role to play. So, again, what we find, even just with the institutional church system, is you're not going to find it here. It's not there. The way that we make church leaders is not in there either. We're going to claim that he made us and bought us. We're going to claim we glorify him and we live his way. We're going to claim that he calls the shots. But we're going to choose a whole bunch of stuff that he never revealed as far as how we spend our weeks, how we spend our precious time gathering together as saints. You can. Free to. Completely free to. I used to. Okay? But I'm not making that choice anymore. For some time now, we just stepped out of that. We said, you know what? This is not. Is there good that comes out of it? Well, sure. Right? Is his word preached there? Sure. His word doesn't return void. Okay? There's good that comes out of believers coming together. However, I think there's a higher level of, first of all, obedience. I think obedience is important. Do you actually care what he said, what he wants, how he said to do things? Well, maybe we should just obey what he said. But secondly, when we obey him, I think it becomes more effective. I think it has a greater end result when we obey. Because then we can get to the destination that he wanted us to, rather than settling for something else. I am going to do at least another video or two on church leadership. It's going to be similar to some of this stuff, but there's some other things to consider. I've spent years thinking through these things, wrestling through it, praying, and just seeking what he would have, what's actually here. And part of the problem is that when I wind up making these judgment calls, when I wind up saying, okay, here's what he says, I don't find a lot of evidence for it out there in the world, right? Why? Because everyone's pretty much stuck in the institutional Christian church with their building, with their, I don't want to say pew warming, but they sit there and they don't really do anything other than show up on time, rise when they're supposed to rise, sit when they're supposed to sit, leave when they're supposed to leave, and, sing along when they're supposed to sing along. And when I compare just all of it to what he reveals, I don't see a lot of it out there in the world. But I believe he's right. And I believe that we have the freedom to obey him and to step out by faith. That he's got a better plan to function. He's got a better plan to make leaders. He's got a better plan to allow those leaders to function. And when we actually do things his ways, it'll be better for everyone involved. So I'll see you guys next time. Thank you for your time. Be blessed. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.